Mason Reed had 8 minutes left to reach the flight that could change his entire future. But when he saw an elderly pilot suddenly collapse near the terminal walkway, he stopped anyway. He called for medical help, stayed beside the stranger, and watched the gate close in front of him. Mason believed he had just lost the most important interview of his career. But less than an hour later, the entire terminal went quiet as a private jet turned back just to collect him. Waiting inside was a chief executive he had never met, already knowing exactly what he did. If you believe genuine kindness always finds its own way back home, stay with Mason's full story until the end. The morning began quietly at a busy international airport in Kansas City. The kind of ordinary Monday when nobody around Mason Reed had any idea what was about to happen. He had arrived hours early for a flight to Denver, carrying a small travel bag and a folder of documents he had reviewed so many times the corners had gone soft. This was not an ordinary trip. That afternoon, Mason had his final interview for the position of Senior Flight Safety Engineer at Hayes Aerospace, a company known across the industry for its uncompromising standards. Almost 18 years in aviation had led him to this single day. 3 months earlier, the maintenance firm where he had worked was bought out and quietly dissolved, and Mason found himself without a job for the first time since he was in his 20s. He was not desperate, not yet, but the quiet arithmetic of a shrinking savings account followed him everywhere. What weighed on him more than money was the promise he had made to himself after his wife passed away, that he would rebuild something stable for the two of them, no matter how long it took. His daughter appeared only briefly that morning, through a short phone call before he left the house. She told him simply, "Good luck," and he smiled and told her he would call again that evening. The moment passed quickly, the way small moments do on days built around something larger. His focus narrowed back to the folder in his hands and the interview waiting for him at the end of the flight. Hayes Aerospace was developing a new generation of commercial aircraft, a program that had drawn attention from airlines and regulators alike for its ambition. If Mason was chosen, it would be the most significant turn his career had taken in years, a return to the kind of work that had first pulled him into aviation as a young engineer. What made the final round unusual was that the company's chief executive, Charlotte Hayes, intended to sit in on it personally. Mason had never met her. He only knew what most people in the industry knew, that she was demanding, precise, and almost obsessive about safety in a way that made her both respected and quietly feared. Some engineers spoke of her with admiration. Others simply avoided drawing her attention. Mason had no strong opinion either way. He only wanted the chance to show what he could do. He reached the departure gate with roughly 15 minutes to spare, early enough to breathe, early enough to run through his notes one final time. For a few minutes, everything felt exactly as it should. The gate agent scanned boarding passes. Passengers filed toward the jet bridge in a loose, unhurried line. Mason checked his phone, saw no messages, and allowed himself a small measure of relief. Then, from somewhere behind him in the crowded terminal, came the unmistakable sound of something heavy striking the floor. An elderly man in a worn pilot's jacket was leaning heavily against the wall near the corridor, his bag already fallen at his feet. His name was Samuel Carter, though nobody in that terminal had any idea who he was. He wore no company uniform, carried no assistant beside him, and gave no outward sign that he was anyone in particular. To the travelers hurrying past, he looked exactly like what he appeared to be, an aging former pilot having a difficult moment. Samuel's knees buckled slightly. He caught himself against the wall, then slid down it until he was sitting, his breathing shallow and uneven. A few passengers glanced over, hesitated, then kept walking, unwilling to risk their own flights for a stranger. Mason looked up at the departure board. Boarding closes in 8 minutes. He hesitated for less than a second before turning back. He crossed the corridor quickly and knelt beside Samuel, checking that the older man was conscious. Samuel was alert but dizzy, unable to stand without support. Mason did not attempt to diagnose anything himself. He called out for airport staff and asked whoever was nearby to send medical assistance immediately. Samuel, still lightheaded, tried to wave him off. "Go," he said. "You're going to miss your flight." Mason asked if anyone was traveling with him. Samuel shook his head. That answer settled it for Mason, who decided he would stay until help physically arrived. In the minutes that followed, he kept Samuel steady, moved his fallen bag out of the walkway, and, at Samuel's request, searched his phone for an emergency contact number. Overhead, the gate announcement echoed through the terminal. Final boarding call. Samuel urged him again to leave, more insistently this time, but Mason stayed exactly where he was. The gate sat only a short distance away, close enough that he could still see it through the crowd. He knew he could likely make it if he ran immediately. But Samuel still had no medical staff beside him, and Mason was not willing to leave a stranger alone on the floor of an airport corridor. When the response team finally arrived, checking Samuel's pulse and asking him careful questions, Mason stood and ran toward the gate as fast as he could move. The door had already closed. Out past the glass, the aircraft was still visible, beginning its slow pushback from the jet bridge. A gate agent apologized and explained gently but firmly that the door could not be reopened once the process had started. Mason stood at the window and watched the plane ease away, feeling strangely calm rather than furious. He did not blame Samuel. He did not blame himself either. He simply stood there in silence, absorbing what had just happened. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An email had arrived from the recruiting team at Hayes Aerospace, its subject line blunt and unmistakable. Final interview attendance is mandatory. If Mason failed to reach Denver on time, the message explained, a backup candidate waiting in reserve would be interviewed in his place. He read it twice, feeling the weight of it settle somewhere behind his ribs, then slid the phone back into his pocket and turned to look for Samuel, who was being helped onto a stretcher chair by two paramedics near the far wall. Samuel was examined at the airport's medical office and found to be stable, needing rest and observation before he could continue his own journey. Mason returned briefly to retrieve the jacket he had left near a row of seats, and it was there that Samuel noticed he was still at the airport at all. He asked where Mason's flight had gone. "Gone," Mason said simply. Samuel's expression shifted from gratitude into something closer to alarm. He asked where Mason had actually been headed, and at first Mason brushed the question aside, unwilling to make his own bad luck part of the conversation. But Samuel asked again, more directly, and Mason finally admitted he had been on his way to Denver for an interview at Hayes Aerospace. Something changed in Samuel's face the moment he heard the name. "Hayes Aerospace," he repeated. Mason nodded. Samuel studied him for a long moment, then asked what position he had been interviewing for. "Flight safety," Mason told him. Samuel asked for his full name, and Mason gave it, a little puzzled by the sudden intensity of the questions. Samuel reached for his phone. Mason immediately told him it wasn't necessary. Samuel asked why not, and Mason explained plainly that he had made his own choice to stay behind. Nobody owed him anything for it. That single detail seemed to catch Samuel's attention more than anything else Mason had said. "If you had known for certain you would miss the interview," Samuel asked, "would you still have stopped?" Mason thought about it only briefly. "If the person on the floor were still you," he said, "yes." Samuel laughed quietly, a short, surprised sound. It was, he said, exactly the kind of judgment the aviation industry needed and so rarely found, the willingness to put a stranger's safety ahead of a schedule that mattered enormously to oneself. Mason had no idea that the man in front of him had once been among the most respected test pilots Hayes Aerospace had ever employed, a name still spoken with reverence inside the company's engineering halls. Samuel opened his contacts list. A single name appeared on the screen, Charlotte Hayes. He placed the call without hesitation, watching Mason's face carefully as it connected. Mason opened his mouth to object again, but Samuel raised a hand, asking for a moment, and turned slightly away as the line picked up on the other end. Whatever words passed in that first exchange were quiet, unhurried, and clearly familiar, the tone of two people who had known each other for a very long time. Mason sat down heavily in the nearest chair, still absorbing the fact that the man he had stopped for was not simply a stranger who happened to need help. He thought about the closed gate, the email in his pocket, and the interview that was likely already being handed to someone else. None of it made sense yet. He had made his choice without expecting anything in return, and whatever Samuel was doing now felt like it belonged to a different story entirely, one Mason had not asked to be part of. He glanced toward the wall of windows, where the sky outside had turned a flat, uneventful gray, and wondered whether the flight he had lost had already reached the next stretch of clouds without him, carrying someone else's future forward instead of his own. In Denver, Charlotte Hayes was preparing for the meeting that would precede the final round of interviews, reviewing a short stack of candidate files spread across her desk. Logan Brooks, the company's vice president of operations, stepped into her office to inform her that one candidate, a man named Mason Reed, appeared unlikely to arrive at all. Logan considered it a clear warning sign. A candidate who couldn't manage to show up on time, he said, had no business being trusted with the safety of a multi-billion-dollar program. Charlotte said nothing in response, unwilling to draw a conclusion before she had more information. That was when her personal phone rang. The name on the screen read Samuel Carter, and she answered immediately. Samuel had worked alongside her father for decades before becoming, in the years since, something close to a mentor for Charlotte herself as she took over leadership of the company. He explained, briefly and without drama, what had just happened at the airport. "Are you all right?" she asked. Samuel told her he was fine. Then he added something quieter. "But the man who kept me from being alone on that floor just missed his own flight because of me." Charlotte asked for the man's name, Mason Reed. She went still for a moment, glancing down at the folder already open on her desk. It was the exact candidate Logan had just recommended cutting from consideration. Samuel continued, explaining that Mason hadn't known who he was helping, hadn't asked for money, hadn't requested a business card or an introduction of any kind. He knew the gate was closing, Samuel said. He stayed anyway. Charlotte turned the pages of Mason's file again, this time more slowly. 18 years in aviation. Thousands of documented hours analyzing system failures across multiple aircraft platforms. No controversies attached to his name, no headlines, nothing beyond a long, quiet record of careful, competent work. He was, in almost every visible sense, an anonymous expert who had simply never sought attention for what he did well. She asked where Mason was now. "Still in Kansas City," Samuel answered. Charlotte checked the schedule on her monitor. The next available commercial flight would put him hours behind, arriving well past any reasonable window for the interview. Logan suggested, not unreasonably, that they simply move forward with the backup candidate already scheduled to arrive that afternoon. Charlotte did not agree. At a nearby airfield outside Kansas City, one of the company's Gulfstream jets had just departed on a repositioning flight toward Denver after dropping off a small group of engineers earlier that morning. Charlotte picked up the line to flight operations and asked a direct question. Could the aircraft return to Kansas City without violating any operational rule or disrupting another scheduled flight? The answer came back within minutes. It could. Charlotte made her decision without further discussion. "Bring it back," she said. It had nothing to do with sentiment, and everything to do with wanting to see, in person, exactly what kind of man would place a stranger's safety above the most important opportunity of his own career. Logan didn't argue the point aloud, but the tightness in his jaw suggested he thought the decision was a mistake, a soft indulgence dressed up as good judgment. Charlotte closed the folder, set it neatly on the corner of her desk, and told her assistant to clear the next hour from her calendar. Mason was standing at a service counter, trying to work out whether any remaining flight could still get him to Denver in time. He was prepared to pay an unreasonable price for a new ticket, and he had even begun considering whether renting a car and driving through the night might be possible if Hayes Aerospace could be persuaded to push the interview back by even a few hours. His phone rang. A voice from the Hayes Aerospace recruiting office asked whether he was still at the airport. Mason assumed the call was to cancel the interview altogether. He began apologizing for the delay before the woman on the line could finish speaking. She cut in gently. "Miss Hayes has already been informed," she said. Mason braced himself, certain he was about to be told his opportunity had ended. Instead, she said, "Please make your way to the Atlantic Aviation Terminal." He didn't understand. "Why?" he asked. "The aircraft is returning to collect you," she told him. For a moment, Mason was certain he had misheard. Standing near the glass wall of the private terminal a short while later, he watched a Gulfstream in Hayes Aerospace's understated dark livery ease onto the ramp outside. There was no spectacle to it. No limousine waiting at the curb, no press cameras, no fanfare of any kind. But the ground crew moving briskly across the tarmac were clearly expecting exactly one passenger. Mason. Samuel, meanwhile, had been brought to a private lounge inside the same terminal after paramedics cleared him to travel again. He stood near the entrance, watching as Mason approached, and it was only now that Mason began to understand the older man was no ordinary retired pilot. Samuel finally introduced himself properly. "Samuel Carter," he said, "former chief test pilot for Hayes Aerospace." Mason stared at him, momentarily speechless. Samuel extended a hand. "Thank you," he said, "for helping an old man before you knew who he was." Mason shook it, though he still felt compelled to protest. "You didn't need to bring the plane back for me," he said. Samuel smiled faintly. "That wasn't my decision to make." A moment later, the aircraft door opened and a pilot in a crisp uniform stepped down onto the tarmac. "Mr. Reed," she said, "Miss Hayes is waiting for you in Denver." Mason climbed the short stairway into the cabin, still only half believing what was happening around him. The interior was quiet, understated, nothing like the images that come to mind when people imagine private aviation, just clean lines and the low hum of the engines warming behind him. He sat near the window and looked out at the terminal where, less than an hour earlier, he had watched his own future disappear through a pane of glass. Now he sat alone in the cabin of a corporate jet that had been sent back specifically to carry him to the very interview he believed he had already lost. A turn of events so unlikely that for the length of the taxi and takeoff, he simply stopped trying to make sense of it and let the aircraft carry him forward. Somewhere beneath him, the terminal grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely, and Mason closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself, just briefly, to believe that the morning's disaster might not be a disaster after all. Mason arrived at the Hayes Aerospace headquarters later than the original schedule had called for, but still well within the same day. He was led directly into a modest conference room, not the sprawling boardroom he had half expected. Charlotte had specifically requested that they speak privately first, before anyone else joined. This was Mason's first time meeting her in person. She gave no indication of treating him as some kind of rescuer to be thanked and celebrated. Her manner stayed entirely professional, measured, almost clinical. "Mr. Reed," she said, "you understand that missing your flight could have cost you this position entirely." "Yes," Mason answered. "Then why didn't you leave the moment airport staff had been called?" Mason explained that calling for help didn't mean the situation was resolved. Responsibility, in his understanding, hadn't truly been handed off until someone qualified had physically taken over. He had spent enough years around aviation to internalize a simple principle: never treat a task as finished while accountability is still hanging in the air, unclaimed. Charlotte recognized immediately what he was describing, the exact discipline of a proper safety handoff, the kind of thinking her own engineers sometimes struggled to apply consistently under pressure. What had begun as a story about kindness shifted, almost without either of them noticing, into a genuine professional evaluation. She pressed him further, moving into questions about system failures, human factors, and the pressure that tight schedules place on careful judgment. Mason answered without embellishment. He had watched more than one incident over the years trace back to a single careless phrase repeated under deadline pressure: "Probably fine." In aviation, he told her, probably fine isn't a standard anyone can rely on. It was the first time Charlotte allowed herself a small, genuine smile. Logan entered partway through the conversation, clearly displeased that the day's schedule had been upended on Mason's account. He posed a series of difficult, pointed questions, apparently determined to prove that Mason had strong field experience but little real capacity for leadership. Mason didn't argue with him or grow defensive. He worked through each scenario Logan raised methodically, relying on logic rather than charm. Charlotte watched closely, her attention sharpening with every answer. It wasn't because Samuel had vouched for him. It was because, question after question, Mason was simply good at what he did, in a way that couldn't easily be faked or rehearsed. There was something else present in the room too, quiet and unspoken, a current of mutual respect that hadn't yet become anything more than that. Charlotte found herself drawn to his calmness, to the way he answered even hostile questions without flinching, but she gave the feeling no space to grow beyond simple professional admiration, not yet. Whatever this was, it would have to wait, if it was anything at all worth naming. Logan gathered his notes at the end of the session with the stiff, unhurried motions of a man who had not gotten the outcome he expected, and left the room without offering Mason so much as a handshake, a small detail that Charlotte noted but chose, for the moment, to let pass without remark. The interview did not end with Mason receiving an offer on the spot. Hayes Aerospace was in the middle of resolving a real active problem on one of its prototype aircraft, and it would not stay conveniently outside the room. An unusual oscillation warning had shown up in the data from a flight control actuator, flagged during a routine ground diagnostic earlier that day. Logan believed it was a faulty sensor, nothing more. His plan was straightforward: replace the sensor and continue ground testing the following morning as originally scheduled. Charlotte turned to Mason and asked, simply, what he thought. As a candidate rather than an employee, Mason technically had no authority to weigh in. He asked permission to look at whatever data could be shared, and after a brief pause, Charlotte nodded. He studied the readouts for several minutes in silence. Then he pointed to something specific. If this were purely a sensor fault, he said, the related signals shouldn't be shifting in the same rhythm as the load cycle. That kind of synchronized drift suggested something else entirely, possibly a mounting point or a section of wiring being disturbed by vibration rather than a component simply failing on its own. Logan pushed back immediately. Delaying the test, he argued, would cost the company a significant amount of money it hadn't budgeted for. Mason answered evenly. Then lose the money tonight, he said, instead of losing the aircraft tomorrow. Nobody in the room spoke for a moment. Charlotte gave the order to inspect it further. When technicians opened the relevant panel, they found that Mason had been right about the part that mattered most. A connector cluster hadn't failed outright, but it had loosened by an almost imperceptible margin under the stress of repeated vibration. Mason hadn't performed some miraculous save of the entire aircraft through instinct alone. He had simply built a reasonable hypothesis from the data in front of him, methodically, without drama, which made the moment feel more grounded and more convincing than any dramatic gesture could have. Left unaddressed, the loose connection might have produced an intermittent false signal at exactly the wrong moment during continued testing. Charlotte turned to Logan and asked why his team hadn't already considered that possibility. Logan admitted, somewhat reluctantly, that the pressure of the deadline had shaped how the team had approached the diagnostic, narrowing their attention toward the fastest explanation rather than the most complete one. Charlotte looked at Mason for a long moment. In the span of a single morning, he had done the same thing twice without hesitation, placing safety ahead of schedule, first for a stranger on an airport floor and now for an aircraft carrying the company's future inside its airframe. It was precisely the instinct she had been trying, with limited success, to rebuild inside her own organization's culture for months. She didn't offer him the job in that exact moment, not yet, but something in her posture had shifted, a quiet recalibration that Logan seemed to notice as well, judging by the tight set of his shoulders as he left to relay the inspection findings to the rest of the engineering team, leaving Mason and Charlotte alone once again in the sudden quiet of the conference room. For a moment neither of them spoke, the events of the afternoon still settling around them, and Charlotte found herself thinking not about the connector or the delayed test, but about how rare it was to watch someone make the harder, costlier choice twice in a single day without ever once treating it as remarkable. Samuel arrived in Denver the following day, cleared to travel after a final round of checks confirmed he was healthy enough to fly. Charlotte met with him privately, and it was during that meeting that Mason learned Samuel hadn't come to Denver merely to visit old colleagues at the company he had once served. Charlotte had actually invited him to join an independent committee tasked with evaluating the new flight safety program from the ground up. Hayes Aerospace stood at something of a crossroads. The company had grown quickly, and a number of executives were eager to accelerate certification timelines and get new aircraft into customers' hands sooner rather than later. Charlotte worried quietly and persistently that the pace of growth was slowly turning the company's safety culture into little more than paperwork, a set of procedures followed in form but not always in spirit. Samuel put it to her directly during their conversation. "You don't need another person who tells you what you want to hear," he said. "You need someone willing to slow the entire system down the moment something feels wrong." Charlotte glanced toward Mason as Samuel spoke. Notably, Samuel did not ask her to hire him. He made a deliberate point of not doing so. "Hire him if he's good," Samuel said. "Not because he helped me." The distinction mattered, and it preserved something important about Mason's own standing in the situation, keeping his qualifications separate from whatever debt of gratitude Samuel might have felt toward him. After reviewing Mason's full record, the interview itself, and the way he had handled the actuator data the day before, Charlotte made him a formal offer. Director of Flight Safety Integration, she said. It was a considerably higher role than the one he had originally applied for. Mason was stunned. Still, he didn't accept immediately. He asked what real authority the position carried. Would he have the power to halt a test himself if he believed there was genuine risk involved, without needing to seek approval first? Charlotte told him yes, even if it costs the company millions of dollars, he asked. She looked at him directly. Even if it costs me millions of dollars. Mason accepted the offer. It was, in its own quiet way, the first real point of connection between the two of them, a shared conviction that responsibility mattered more than appearances, more than optics, more than any single quarter's results. Neither of them said anything more sentimental than that, but something had settled into place between them, an understanding neither one felt any need to name aloud just yet. Samuel watched the exchange from across the room with an expression that gave very little away, though later, walking with Mason toward the elevator, he allowed himself a brief, satisfied remark about how strange it was that a collapsed knee in an airport corridor had led, however indirectly, to exactly the outcome he had hoped for without ever having to ask for it directly. Mason didn't quite know how to respond to that, so he simply thanked him again, and Samuel waved the gratitude away with the same brisk impatience he seemed to bring to most compliments aimed in his direction. As the elevator doors closed, Samuel added one last thought. Almost as an afterthought, that the aviation industry had a way of rewarding people who did the right thing without expecting anything back, though it rarely happened quickly enough for anyone to plan around it, and Mason spent the rest of the ride down turning that sentence over in his mind. Several months passed. By then, Mason had become a genuinely respected member of the team, his judgment trusted enough that engineers routinely sought his opinion before escalating concerns to leadership. His relationship with Charlotte remained entirely professional on the surface, though certain small details had crept in over time. They were often the last two people to leave the control room after a long testing day. Charlotte occasionally brought coffee for the team and, without ever being told twice, remembered that Mason took his black. He had become one of the few people at the company willing to disagree with the chief executive directly, in front of others, when he believed she was wrong. None of it was dramatic. There was no obvious flirtation, only a quiet, accumulating familiarity. Then came the day of the most important test flight the company had scheduled that year. Key clients and investors were present, watching from an observation deck overlooking the runway. A successful result could secure a contract significant enough to shape the company's next several years. Just before the aircraft began taxiing, Mason noticed something small and easy to overlook in the hydraulic pressure trend data. It hadn't crossed any defined threshold. Logan, monitoring the same readouts, insisted the system remained comfortably within normal parameters. Mason had a decision to make. If he called for a delay and it turned out to be nothing, his credibility inside the company would take a real hit, especially in front of the clients watching from above. He thought back briefly to that morning at the airport months earlier. 8 minutes. A stranger who needed help. A schedule that mattered enormously. This felt exactly the same. "Hold the aircraft," Mason said. Charlotte turned toward him. "Reason?" He walked her through the data in a few clipped, precise sentences. She glanced at the clock, weighing the cost of the delay against everything Mason had just told her. "Test suspended," she said. No argument, no hesitation. A subsequent inspection revealed a valve beginning to show early, intermittent signs of sticking, not yet a disaster, but enough to validate exactly the kind of caution Mason had insisted on. Logan, standing nearby as the technicians confirmed the finding, was forced to acknowledge that his own habit of chasing the schedule had repeatedly caused him to underweight smaller warning signs over the preceding months. Charlotte didn't remove Logan from his role out of any impulse toward punishment or revenge. Instead, she restructured the authority and reporting lines of the entire safety division, giving Mason's team a level of independent standing it hadn't held before, one that no longer required routing every concern through operations first. The story reached its turning point not through the defeat of a villain, but through an entire system finally growing into the shape it should have had all along, a change that took hold quietly, in policy documents and revised procedures rather than in any single dramatic confrontation. The observation deck emptied slowly that afternoon, clients murmuring among themselves about the delay, some visibly frustrated, though by the time the rescheduled flight took off 2 days later without incident, most of that frustration had quietly turned into something closer to confidence, the kind that comes from watching a company choose caution over convenience when it actually mattered. After the successful retest the following week, the company held a small dinner, nothing extravagant or overly formal. Samuel attended, watching from a distance as Mason and Charlotte fell into conversation near the balcony before deliberately excusing himself and slipping away to give them the space. It was the first time Charlotte and Mason had spoken about anything outside of work. Mason brought up the day she had ordered the Gulfstream back to Kansas City, admitting that the whole situation had felt strange to him at the time, almost uncomfortable. "Why?" she asked. "I didn't want to be hired because I helped Samuel," he said. "You weren't hired because of that," she answered. Mason looked at her, waiting. "The aircraft came back because Samuel helped me see your file in the first place," Charlotte explained, "but you have this position because of what you actually are." The distinction mattered to him more than he expected it to. "Then why did you really bring it back?" he asked. "Because I wanted to meet someone willing to give up an opportunity rather than leave another person behind," she said. A brief silence settled between them, comfortable rather than awkward. Whatever was developing between them stayed grounded, unhurried, entirely appropriate to two adults who had built mutual respect before anything else. Charlotte admitted somewhat quietly that after years of leading the company, she had grown used to people being kind to her mainly because they knew exactly who she was. Mason offered a small, dry smile. "Lucky for you," he said, "by the time I met you, I already knew." Charlotte laughed genuinely in a way that seemed to surprise even her. Then she asked, if there's ever a day when we aren't talking about aircraft, would you want to get coffee? Mason studied her for a moment before answering. Yes, he said. There was no dramatic kiss, no grand declaration of feeling. Only the quiet sense of a door being opened, gently, without either of them rushing through it. The city lights spread out below the balcony, and for a while neither of them said anything else, content simply to stand there, letting the evening settle around them without needing to fill every silence with words, aware that whatever came next would arrive at its own pace rather than being forced into existence before either of them was ready for it. Inside, the sound of muted conversation and clinking glasses drifted out through the open doors, and somewhere among the guests, Samuel was telling a story to a small cluster of engineers, gesturing broadly with one hand the way he always did when he thought nobody important was listening, though he was, in fact, watching the balcony out of the corner of his eye the entire time, a faint and satisfied expression settling over his face as he did. Charlotte eventually excused herself to greet a departing investor, and Mason lingered a moment longer at the railing, turning the whole strange sequence of the past several months over in his mind, from the sound of Samuel's bag hitting the floor to the closed gate, the returning jet, and now this. None of it had unfolded the way he expected, and he found, standing there in the cool evening air, that he was in no hurry at all for it to start making sense. Half a year later, Mason had settled fully into his role. The safety program he and Charlotte had built together had quietly become the internal standard against which every other department measured itself. Samuel still visited the hangar from time to time. He liked to remind Mason, half-joking, that he still owed him a flight. "You're the reason I missed that one," Mason would answer. "And look where it took you," Samuel would say, grinning. His relationship with Charlotte had developed slowly, deliberately, without ever rushing forward. There had been a handful of quiet dinners and coffee meetings, nothing performative or rushed. Charlotte never tried to insert herself abruptly into Mason's role as a father, and his daughter was kept almost entirely outside the unfolding relationship, appearing only briefly near the story's close, one ordinary morning as Mason prepared to leave for work. Charlotte called him that day. She was already at the airport. Samuel was there too. Hayes Aerospace was preparing for its final certification flight, the culmination of everything the team had worked toward that year. She asked if he was coming. This time he told her, "I won't be the one missing a flight." "Don't be so sure," she said. "Samuel's here?" Mason laughed. The story closed at the airport. Samuel stood near the new aircraft watching the ground crew complete their final checks. Charlotte waited at the base of the stairway. Mason walked toward them both, unhurried. He looked out across the runway and found himself remembering the morning months earlier when he had stood helplessly behind a pane of glass, watching a commercial jet pull away without him. At the time, he had believed he'd just lost the most important flight of his entire life. The truth had turned out to be exactly the opposite. The flight he missed that morning had carried him, indirectly and unexpectedly, to precisely where he needed to be. Charlotte extended her hand toward him as he reached the stairway. Mason took it. There was no need for grand declarations, no dramatic speech to mark the moment. The two of them simply turned together and began walking toward the waiting aircraft, side by side, the morning light stretching long and pale across the tarmac ahead of them, while somewhere behind them Samuel followed at his own unhurried pace, content, as he so often was, to let the two people he had unwittingly brought together find their own way forward from here. Somewhere behind him at the terminal, a new group of travelers hurried toward their own gates, chasing their own tight schedules and their own quiet emergencies, unaware of the small, ordinary act of kindness that had unfolded in that same corridor months before, and unaware of how far a single decision to stop, rather than keep walking, could eventually carry someone. Mason never set out to be noticed. He simply chose, in a single ordinary moment, to put someone else's safety before his own ambition, without knowing where that choice would lead or whether it would cost him everything he had worked toward. That is the quiet truth behind so many turning points in life. The opportunities that matter most rarely announce themselves in advance, and the people who deserve them are often the ones who never stop to calculate the cost of doing the right thing. If this story reminded you that kindness is never truly wasted, even when the timing feels impossible, carry that thought with you today. Somewhere ahead, an ordinary decision made without any expectation of reward may be quietly shaping a future you cannot yet see.